The sky was a bruised charcoal, lit only by the violent, jagged veins of lightning that tore through the clouds. Dead Man's Reef lived up to its name tonight, the black basalt rocks acting like teeth, chewing on the remains of a sleek, midnight-colored vessel that certainly didn't belong to any local fisherman. Kalani Clarke fought against the gale, her boots skidding on the slick, salt-sprayed stone. The power was out across the entire coast, leaving the world in a state of primal darkness where the only map was the memory of the land in her bones. She moved toward the shoreline, her lantern casting a frantic, swinging glow over the debris. Amidst the splintered carbon fiber and tangled sea kelp, she saw him. He wasn't a ghost, though the blood streaking down his face made him look like one. He lay sprawled against a sharp outcrop, his body half submerged in the rising tide. Even broken and shivering, the man looked like a king cast out of his own realm. His suit, though shredded by the reef, was clearly worth more than Kalani's entire cabin, and the heavy watch on his wrist glinted mockingly under the lightning. Kalani dropped to her knees, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She checked for a pulse, her fingers pressing against a neck that felt like corded steel. It was there, thrumming with a desperate, stubborn rhythm. As she shifted his weight to pull him higher onto the rocks, his head lolled back, revealing features that were sharp and aristocratic, even under the mask of his injuries. He looked less like a victim and more like a fallen king cast out of his own empire. Every instinct honed by her years of isolation screamed at her to leave him. A man like this, found in the wreckage of a nameless vessel during a total blackout, brought nothing but trouble. She thought of her grandfather's warnings about the world beyond the horizon, but then she heard it, a low, ruined groan that cut through the thunder. It was the sound of a man refusing to let the shadows take him. "Help!" he rasped, the word barely audible over the crashing surf, his voice raw with the kind of agony that made her stomach clench. Kalani looked at the horizon, where no rescue lights appeared, and then back at the man who represented a world of danger she had spent years avoiding. She thought of her grandfather, the legendary fisherman who never turned his back on a soul lost at sea. With a grunt of effort, she hooked her arms under his, bracing her boots against the slick stone. With a guttural cry of effort, she began the agonizing process of dragging the stranger up the cliffs, moving him away from the sea's reach and toward the sanctuary of her cabin. Kalani knew she was crossing a line from which there was no return. The fire in the hearth had settled into a low, rhythmic pulse of embers, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the cedar-planked walls of the cabin. Seung-Woo Baek clawed his way back to consciousness. The transition from the black abyss of the ocean to the dim heat of the room felt like a physical blow. His senses returned in sharp, painful fragments, the smell of pine resin, the distant roar of the storm, and the agonizing heat radiating from his own battered chest. Instinct, honed by a decade of avoiding assassinations in Seoul, took over before his eyes even opened. His hand lashed out, searching for a weapon, a throat, anything to exert the control that was his birthright. His fingers caught only the rough weave of a wool blanket. A sharp, guttural hiss escaped his lips as he tried to sit up, his broken ribs screaming in protest. The room spun, a dizzying blur of wood and shadow, but it stopped abruptly when a cold, sharpened edge of steel pressed firmly against the hollow of his throat. "I wouldn't," a voice said. It was low, melodic, and entirely unimpressed. Seung-Woo froze, his breath hitching. He looked up, his one good eye focusing on the woman standing over him. She was framed by the amber glow of the fire, her silhouette powerful and unyielding. She held a long, traditional fishing spear with a steady hand, the tip glinting with a lethal promise.
Her expression wasn't one of fear or frantic adrenaline. It was the quiet, terrifying calm of a guardian who knew exactly where the high ground lay. "Who are you?" he managed to rasp, his voice sounding like dry earth shifting. He tried to muster the icy authority that usually made his subordinates tremble, but in his ruined silk shirt and blood-caked skin, the effect was lost. "I'm the woman's floor you're currently bleeding on," Kalani replied, her gaze tracking the movement of his throat against the blade. She saw the flickers of calculation in his eyes, the way he was measuring the distance, the strength in her arms, and his own limited mobility. "And if you're looking for your gun, I tossed it into the deep locker. It's as useless as your name is on this reef." Seung-Woo felt a rare surge of genuine shock. He was a man used to being feared, used to the weight of his family's legacy acting as an invisible shield. Here, stripped of his empire and his technology, he was nothing more than wreckage. He looked at her natural hair pulled back and the intelligent, fierce focus in her eyes. "You're a long way from home, Baek Seung-Woo." She read the name from a water-damaged ID she had pulled from his pocket. "The question is, did you bring the storm with you, or are you just the wreckage it left behind?" Seung-Woo let his head fall back against the pillow, his strength failing him. "Both," he whispered. Kalani watched him for a long moment before finally lowering the spear. She didn't trust him, but she had heard his screams in the dark, and she knew she couldn't walk away now. The blackout at Dead Man's Reef had brought a monster to her door, and now she had to decide if she would help him heal or watch him drown in the shadows of his own past. The morning light filtered through the cabin's salt-crusted windows in pale, gray streaks, revealing the true extent of the isolation. Seung-Woo Bok sat up with a grimace, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket of his ruined jacket. He pulled out his phone, but the screen remained a cold, black void, unresponsive to his touch despite the backup battery he always carried. He scanned the room for a router, a signal, any tether to the digital world that served as the nervous system of his empire, but he found only the low hum of a battery-powered radio and the crackle of the wood stove. "Don't bother," Kalani said, entering the room with a tray of steaming broth. "The storm took out the mainland relay tower last night. No internet, no map, and no power until the council decides we're worth the fuel to fix it." Seung-Woo felt a cold dread settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the damp island air. To a man like him, being off the grid wasn't a vacation, it was a death sentence. Without his encrypted channels, he couldn't signal his loyalists or track the movements of the traders who had sent him into the sea. He was a ghost, haunting a corner of the world that didn't even appear on most modern GPS systems. He looked at Kalani, who was moving through the small kitchen with a quiet, grounded confidence. She didn't need a satellite to tell her where she was or how to survive. "I need to get to the mainland," he said, his voice regaining some of its gravelly edge. "I can pay you 10 times the value of this house if you get me to a working terminal." Kalani stopped and looked at him, her expression shifting from pity to a sharp, dry amusement. She had heard enough from his feverish muttering to know he was used to buying his way out of every shadow. "Money doesn't move boats in a gale, and a terminal won't help you if the cables are at the bottom of the channel," she replied, setting the bowl down. "You're not in Seoul, Baek Seung-Woo. Out here, your influence is a ghost. You're just a man with 3 broken ribs and a target on his back." He looked at his hands, scarred and pale, realizing for the first time that his survival was no longer a matter of strategy or wealth. It was entirely dependent on the fisherman's girl who had dragged him from the rocks. She was his map, his medic, and his only shield against the world he had left behind. The silence of the island was absolute, a heavy weight that reminded him that for all his power, he was currently nothing more than a guest in her sanctuary.
The storm reached its crescendo, the wind shrieking like a wounded animal as it clawed at the cedar shingles above. Inside, the darkness was thick, held back only by the amber pulse of the wood stove and a single tallow candle that cast Kalani's shadow large against the timber walls. Seung-Woo lay back, his breathing hitched and shallow, each inhale a reminder of the punctured reality of his lungs. He watched her through a haze of fever, his vision blurring as she approached with a stone mortar and pestle. She didn't use the sterile, chemical ointments he was accustomed to in the private clinics of Seoul. Instead, the air filled with the sharp, medicinal scent of crushed sea holly and fermented kelp. Kalani knelt beside him, her movements fluid and devoid of the hesitation he expected from a stranger. She peeled back the damp bandages she had applied hours earlier, revealing the mottled purple and black bruising that mapped out his shattered ribs. "This is going to burn," she murmured, her eyes meeting his with a steady, quiet intensity, "but it will draw out the heat." As she applied the cool, thick paste to his skin, Seung-Woo's jaw tightened, his fingers digging into the rough wool of the blanket. The sensation was an agonizing paradox of ice and fire, but as the minutes ticked by, the sharp, stabbing pressure in his chest began to dull into a heavy, manageable ache. She worked with a clinical focus, her hands sure and strong, manifesting a knowledge passed down through generations of healers who had survived with nothing but what the tide provided. In the flickering light, the lines between their worlds seemed to dissolve. He was no longer the head of operations for a criminal empire, and she was no longer just a girl from a forgotten island. They were simply two souls anchored in the dark, fighting against a common enemy that howled outside the door. "Why stay?" he whispered, his voice a ruined rasp. "You know what I am. You know the danger I bring." Kalani didn't look up as she secured a fresh linen wrap around his torso. "Because the sea brought you to my reef, and I don't let the tide take back what I've already claimed," she replied simply. She sat back, wiping her hands on a cloth, her silhouette unyielding against the storm. For the first time, Seung-Woo felt something more dangerous than the men hunting him, the realization that he was beginning to trust the woman who held his life in her hands. The storm had finally begun to exhaust itself, leaving behind a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the cliffs like a shroud. Inside the cabin, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic click of the cooling wood stove, but the peace was an illusion. Seung-Woo was the first to hear it, a high-pitched mechanical whine that didn't belong to the wind or the gulls. It was the sound of a predator. He struggled to sit up, his face pale against the firelight. "A drone," he rasped, his eyes darting to the window. "They're using thermal imaging. If it passes the glass, they'll have our heat signatures. They'll know I'm alive." Kalani didn't hesitate. She didn't ask how he knew or what kind of technology could pierce the island's gloom. She simply grabbed her grandfather's heavy oilskin coat and the long, iron-tipped spear she had used to keep Seung-Woo at bay. She knew the syndicate was professional, the kind of organization that got witnesses killed, and she wasn't about to let her home become a crime scene. She slipped out into the cold, damp air, the fog dampening the sound of her boots on the porch. The drone was hovering near the tree line, a small black insect against the gray sky, its red light blinking with a cold digital pulse. It was scanning, moving in a slow, calculated grid that would bring it to the cabin in seconds. Kalani moved through the tall grass, her body low, disappearing into the terrain she had mastered since childhood. She reached the base of a jagged rock formation, her breath shallow. The drone drifted closer, the whine of its rotors growing louder, a foreign invader in her sanctuary. She waited for the precise moment when the wind gusted, tilting the machine just enough to expose its underside. With a surge of strength fueled by protective instinct, Kalani launched the spear. It wasn't a throw of desperation, it was a strike of ancestral precision. The iron tip pierced the central housing of the drone, the impact sparking a brief blue flash before the machine spiraled into the surf below. She stood on the cliff's edge, watching the ripples vanish into the dark water. The breach had been closed, but the message was clear. The world was no longer staying behind the horizon. She returned to the cabin, her chest heaving, to find Seung-Woo watching her with a mixture of shock and profound respect. "They'll send more," he warned, his voice low. "Let them," Kalani replied, her jaw setting as she placed the spear back by the door. "They might have the technology, but I have the island, and I don't miss twice." The smell of rain-dampened earth and iron hung in the air as Kalani stepped back inside, the adrenaline from the drone strike still humming in her veins. She found Seung-Woo sitting upright, his one good eye fixed on the door with an intensity that made the small cabin feel smaller. The fire had burned down to a deep glowing crimson, casting his sharp features into a mask of light and shadow. He looked at the spear she leaned against the wall, then back at her, and for the first time the Mafia boss seemed to truly see the woman who had saved him. "You're not just a fisherman's granddaughter," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "You're a warrior who doesn't know she's in a war." Kalani sat across from him, her hands still steady despite the cold. "I know exactly what war I'm in. It's the one where I keep my home from being swallowed by people like you." Seung-Woo looked away, staring into the embers. He began to speak not with the arrogance of a leader, but with the weary weight of a man who had seen too much blood. He told her of the Kim family, of a world where honor wasn't a word, but a currency paid in loyalty and skin. He spoke of his childhood in the shadows of Seoul's high-rises, where he was raised to believe that power was the only shield against the chaos. He admitted to things that should have made her flinch: debts collected with violence and territories defended with ruthlessness. He told her he was a criminal, someone who had seen the worst of humanity and participated in it. But as the night wore on, the narrative shifted. He spoke of the rules, the codes that forbade harming those who were uninvolved, and the absolute mandate that a debt of life must be repaid, no matter the cost. He explained that his betrayal happened because he refused to let a rival organization target a family to get to him. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster with a leash. Kalani watched him, realizing the man on her couch wasn't a mindless predator. He was a man bound by a different kind of iron, one forged in a world where mercy was a weakness, but loyalty was sacred. She saw the hope Dae-jung had mentioned in the transcript, a flicker of something human that had survived the underworld. "I run a gang, Zoe. Kalani," he corrected himself, his slurring words a mix of exhaustion and honesty. "But I've never harmed a soul that didn't choose to be in the game." Kalani nodded slowly. She still didn't trust his world, but she understood his heart. He wasn't just wreckage from a storm. He was a man trying to find a reason to keep fighting. The fog that had shielded the cabin finally tore open, replaced by the harsh, artificial glare of high-intensity floodlights cutting through the mist from the shoreline. The sound of muffled boat engines and the rhythmic splash of boots on wet sand signaled that the breach was no longer digital. The mercenaries had arrived. Seung-Woo struggled to his feet, his jaw tight as he leaned against the timber wall, but Kalani was already moving with the practiced calm of someone who had survived the Atlantic's worst tantrums. She didn't reach for a gun, but for the ancestral knowledge of the island that no outsider could ever possess. "They have the technology, but they don't have the tide," she whispered, her eyes meeting Seung-Woo's with a fierce, intelligent focus. She knew the island was a graveyard of ships, and tonight it would become a graveyard for anyone who threatened her sanctuary. She led the way out the back door, supporting Seung-Woo's weight as they disappeared into the dense tree line.
Behind them, the sounds of doors being kicked in and rapid Korean commands echoed through the salt air. Kalani didn't head for the main road. She steered them toward the jagged basalt cliffs and the hidden entrance of the sea caves. These were the veins of the island, a labyrinth of limestone and rising water that changed with every lunar cycle. To a stranger, it was a death trap of slippery stone and lightless drops. To Kalani, it was a fortress. As they entered the mouth of the primary cavern, the temperature dropped, and the air filled with the heavy organic smell of wet stone and ancient brine. The sound of the mercenaries followed them, the clatter of tactical gear and the sweep of flashlights, creating frantic patterns against the cave walls. Kalani moved with quiet courage, guiding Seung-Woo through narrow fissures and over subterranean streams that surged with the incoming tide. The pursuit was relentless, but Kalani used the terrain like a weapon. She led them over a slick, salt-sprayed ledge that dropped 50 feet into a churning blowhole, knowing exactly where the footing was solid and where the moss would give way under the weight of a man in heavy boots. She heard a shout and a sickening slide behind them, followed by the roar of the ocean claiming another victim. "They're following the light," Seung-Woo rasped, his breathing shallow but his gaze intense. "Then we'll give them all the darkness they can handle," Kalani replied. She extinguished her lantern, plunging them into a primal, absolute blackness that only she knew how to navigate. The storm had broken, but inside the heart of the island, the real battle was just beginning.
The darkness of the sea caves was a living thing, heavy and cold, but Kalani moved through it with the confidence of a predator in its own den. She could hear the frantic breathing of the remaining mercenaries behind them, their high-tech gear clattering against the limestone as they struggled to maintain their footing in a world that refused to be tamed. Beside her, Seung-Woo Baek moved like a shadow, his jaw set in a mask of lethal focus, his presence still radiating the authority of a man used to commanding the tide, even when he was the one being swept away. They emerged from the cave onto a narrow, jagged basalt ledge halfway up the cliffside. The rain had turned into a fine, stinging mist, and the Atlantic churned 100 feet below, a graveyard of ships waiting for fresh tribute. The lead mercenary, a man whose tactical suit marked him as a professional from the Choi organization, stepped out onto the ledge, his rifle raised. The red laser of his sight cut through the fog, searching for Seung-Woo's chest. "You have no map and no power here," Kalani said, her voice carrying over the roar of the surf, steady and fearless against the storm. She didn't reach for a gun, she simply shifted her weight, her salt-stained boots finding the one section of the ledge that hadn't been hollowed out by centuries of erosion. The mercenary fired, but the slick, salt-sprayed stone betrayed him. The recoil, combined with a sudden, violent gust of island wind, sent his footing wide. Kalani didn't hesitate. She used her spear not as a weapon, but as a lever, striking the base of a loose rock formation above the ledge. It was a move of ancestral precision, a strike that only someone raised by the sea could execute. A cascade of stone and ancient brine collapsed, the geography of the reef acting as her executioner. The mercenary vanished into the white foam below without a cry, his technology and firepower rendered useless by the primal law of the island. The remaining men froze, their lights flickering in the mist as they realized they weren't fighting a girl, they were fighting the ocean itself. Kalani stood at the cliff's edge, her silhouette unyielding, the spear held at her side like a scepter. She looked at Seung-Woo, seeing the profound respect in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement that she had saved him not just from the basement of his past, but from the hubris of his world. The ocean had delivered its justice, and as the sirens of his loyalists finally echoed from the far side of the island, Kalani knew the sanctuary she had fought for was safe, even if she was no longer the same woman who had lived within its walls. The heavy thrum of a helicopter's rotors eventually drowned out the rhythmic crash of the surf, its searchlight carving a blinding white path through the dissipating fog. From the darkness of the trees, a team of men in dark suits emerged, not the predators of the Choi organization, but Seung-Woo's own people, led by a man with silver-threaded hair and eyes that missed nothing. They moved with professional efficiency, dropping to one knee as they reached their boss, their relief palpable even in the freezing rain. Seung-Woo back stood tall, the presence of someone used to power returning to his frame despite the bandages beneath his ruined suit. He looked at Dijong, his second-in-command, and then slowly turned his gaze back to Kalani, who stood near the cliff's edge with her spear held loosely at her side. The storm in his eyes had calmed, replaced by an intensity that was far more dangerous because it was quiet and focused. "The debt is settled with the sea, but not with you," Seung-Woo said, his voice carrying clearly over the fading wind. He stepped toward her, ignoring the protest of his broken ribs. "I promise to give you back your life, better and safer than before. But I also promised you a dinner where you could yell at me for ruining your world." Kalani looked at the black SUV waiting near the cabin, and then out at the horizon, where the first hint of a true dawn was beginning to bleed through the gray. She thought of her quiet, resilient life and the isolation that had once been her sanctuary, but now felt like a gilded cage. She had crossed a line the moment she dragged him from the tide, and she realized that the fisherman's girl she used to be was a ghost. "You said I was either incredibly stupid or incredibly brave," Kalani reminded him, a small, terrified and exhilarated smile touching her lips. "Maybe it's time to find out which one it is." Seung-Woo extended his hand, the roughness of his palm a silent promise of protection in a world she didn't yet understand. He didn't offer her a map or an internet connection. He offered her hope and a connection that neither of them had asked for, but both of them felt. Kalani took his hand, her stubborn refusal to be anything less than brave guiding her forward. As they moved toward the waiting vehicles, leaving the graveyard of ships behind, she didn't look back at the cabin or the reef. She looked toward the horizon, ready to see the world that lay beyond the darkness of the basement and the fury of the storm. The storm has finally cleared, but for Kalani and Seung-Woo, the true journey into the unknown is just beginning. Their world, one of salt and iron, the other of power and shadows, has collided in a way that can never be undone. If you found yourself captivated by this unexpected connection between the fisherman's granddaughter and the mafia boss, and you want to see how their impossible bond survives the world beyond the horizon, show your support by hitting the like button. For more tales of quiet courage, fierce loyalty, and the kind of love that sparks in the darkest basements and most dangerous storms, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Hidden Heart Stories. Don't miss a single chapter of these life-altering encounters. Join our community to explore more interesting love and romantic stories that prove, even in a world of violence and secrets, some people are always worth being brave for. Subscribe to Hidden Heart Stories today, where every heart has a secret worth saving.